Civilization is such a broad term. Ask 10 people, you'll hear 10 different answers. Yet, while our civilization matters to us, yours matters to you. In the first of a series of discussions heading to the first ever Conference of Dialogue of Asian Civilizations to be hosted in Beijing, we'll explore what the common Asian culture is, what uniquely the Asian values are, and what it all means to us here as well as to others around the world. Welcome to a special edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. 2 decades ago, Iran proposed the first global dialogue among civilizations, and next week, Asians will come together for a gathering of their own as Beijing hosts the first ever Conference of Dialogue of Asian Civilizations. The United Nations is on board for this dialogue as well. UNESCO is touting this week-long gathering as an opportunity to promote intercultural dialogue with an eye toward building an Asian community of shared future. What role does civilizations play to lead us toward a more positive future or to tear us apart? How can dialogue ensure we head in the right direction? And what inspired China to bring Asians together for such a dialogue now? Joining me in the Beijing studio here is Qinduo, a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution, and Alistair Michie, Secretary General of the British East Asia Council, which is focused on building second channel between China and the UK at the highest level. And also joining us on via satellite from Iran is Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, a political analyst based in Tehran. So, gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you to The Point here. Before we get into the main discussion, I just want to clear some basic starting points. For instance, when we are talking about Asian civilizations, to my 2 guests here in the studio, exactly what we're talking about. Alistair, what are Asian civilizations, and what is Asian civilization, as it is also sometimes used this way?
Well, I think that what we should think in terms of the conference next week, not just about Asian civilization, but about how Asian civilization has over millennia had dialogue and exchange with the rest of the world. And this is picking up this pattern again.
But what does it invoke in your mind when we're talking about Asian civilizations? Do you think about the Asian values, Asian culture, or some kind of Asian style of art or philosophy? What it is?
No, it's about exchange of ideas and inventions, which has been going on for 2 millennia.
How? Why is that unique to Asia?
Because I think what's very important about this conference next week is to put it into this context. It's explaining to the world how Asia has exchanged with the world over the 2 millennia. Buddhism, for example, came in 2,000 years ago into China, utterly changed China. And then if you jump to more recent times, that China gave many inventions to Europe. Europe wasn't aware of them, they came from China at the time, but it did. And that utterly changed Europe. In turn, Marxism, capitalism came out of the UK, came into China and utterly changed China. And now China is still giving ideas like you could say that the BRI, the Belt and Road, is another Asian concept idea or Chinese Asian idea that is going to be shared with the world. You could also say that the reform and opening up is also in the same of a gift of an idea to the world.
So basically you're saying openness, interactivity or inclusiveness are the keywords for you about Asian culture?
It's really can be summarized as simply as this. What China and Asia is promoting is a dialogue of civilizations, which is in diametric opposite of what's coming out of the US at the moment, which is promoting a clash of civilizations, which is totally wrong.
Okay, we're going to get there in just a moment. But Qinduo, very briefly, your take. What is the singular or the plural form of civilization
like
for Asia?
In academic terms, probably you would refer to, say, in China, the Yellow River, Yangtze River, the civilization, Chinese civilization, and then you go to south or southwest west, you have the Indian, is Indus, and of course the Ganges River civilization, and then in the Middle East, of course, you have the Tigris and Euphrates civilization. But diversity, that's one keyword in terms of Asian civilizations. Another keyword would be, I would say, harmony. We stay together, having dialogue, exchanges. We're not trying, say, one civilization tries to dominate or to be superior to another civilization, things like that.
All right. Well, in my beginning, I talked about 2 decades ago that the Iranians actually came up with the idea of a first global dialogue among civilizations. A little bit of background to that was this was shortly after the publication of this very controversial hypothesis by Samuel Huntington talking about the clash of civilizations after the end of the Cold War. So I'm going to go to my Iranian guest, Mr. Khoshcheshm in Tehran here. Welcome, Mr. Khoshcheshm. As I mentioned, in the late 1990s, your former president, Mohammad Khatami, actually introduced the idea of dialogue among civilizations, and this idea was incorporated in some United Nations documents back then. But until 2002, this kind of just disappeared in the public narrative. Would you explain a little bit what was behind Iran's push back then to introduce or to highlight this message, and what happened later?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, as a matter of fact, back then, when Huntington's theory was very much the focus of the Western civilizations, and it was clear that especially the Americans were fond of working out different strategies based on Huntington, and they developed strategies like the Paul Wolfowitz doctrine, which called for impeding regional powers from becoming a global one, or pressuring the countries that have the potential to become a regional power in order to keep the United States reign over the world. Iran was alarmed, and it believed that the future, which would be built based on Huntington's theory, would be very catastrophic. So an institute in Tehran started the idea, and then it was presented to President Khatami, who brought it to the UN. Unfortunately, ever since then, it has been, mostly discussed only at academic levels. But what we see in reality, in real world, is, there are wars and confrontations. It seems to me that it's mostly because of the approach pursued by the U.S. The United States apparently needed a September 11 attack to enforce its Wolfowitz, doctrine, and despite all the, opportunities that have arisen all throughout the last 2 decades, including several, talks and negotiations between Iran and the U.S.-led West, we have always seen that all these deals and talks have ended in failure. Okay. Back in 2001. According to American officials, Iran assisted the United States in its invasion of Afghanistan. But after that, George W. Bush called Iran a member of the Axis of Evil. So there are many other cases. To cut it short, I need to say that the future that we see, we are going to have based on Huntington's theory would be, devastation, war, and a catastrophe for human race. And Iran is trying to resolve differences through talks and dialogue.
How do you see this idea that China is now hosting this first ever conference on dialogue of Asian civilizations? And what do you think is the contribution of Persian civilization in this big Asian family, and possibly for the bigger family of humankind?
Iran, civilizations like Iran, Egypt, Greece, China, and India, they've been living in this world in the form of civilizations, the way we understand, for several thousand years. And they have lots of experience compared with those that have, no more than a few hundred years of history. So experience has proved to all these nations that coexistence and trying to resolve differences would be the best possible way in order to guarantee a prosperous future and welfare for the entire world. It has proved that even though empires might expand and be prosperous for a few decades, they fall apart and there will be a catastrophic future waiting for them. So they have this, understanding of the world that there needs to be some dialogue and an understanding with each other. But for the U.S.-led West, it seems to be rather, they look at talks and dialogue as a way of containment and, imposing their hegemony and reign over the world. That's why many dialogues have failed, not just between the United States and Iran, but between the U.S., the U.S.-led West, and many other nations, including those in Asia.
Okay, Mr. Khoshcheshm, I'm going to interrupt you here. Alistair, you were nodding just now, especially when Mr. Khoshcheshm was talking about the difference in definition or practice of dialogue in what in our dictionary and in the dictionary of the U.S.-led West.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I believe very much looking at the patterns of history. And I think that this conference next week, which was instigated by President Xi himself, is very much looking in a historical perspective. And that the Americans are not looking at any historical perspective. They're only looking at how the U.S. remains as the most powerful military, the most powerful economic nation in the world.
Yeah. Well, let's put the U.S. aside for a moment. I don't think this is really an occasion for China to bash the U.S. or to bash the West. I think there is a very important message being sent there that China is not trying to draw a line between the West and the East by holding this conference. But then my question is, because this is the first ever conference on the dialogue of Asian civilizations, why the Asian emphasis here? Why not the first conference of world civilizations, Qinduo?
In the sense that it comes from a 2015 speech in Boao Forum for Asia. That is the forum, there's a geopolitical and geographical like a definition, that is Asian countries. In that speech, President Xi mentioned about building a community of shared future for Asian nations, for Asian people. So in order to achieve that, we need the dialogue and exchanges among different civilizations and the mutual learning and inclusiveness, so we can achieve that goal. Probably that's part of that efforts, necessary efforts. So he proposed the idea. He promised that China will be planning a conference on the dialogue among different Asian civilizations.
Okay. Alistair.
I think that we, and I hesitate from slightly disagreeing with you, that I think that the root of this conference goes back actually to the 18th Congress Political Report. And if you read that, I mean, for example, Xi said, well, he didn't say it, but he said that, I mean, it was Hu Jintao that delivered the 18th Congress report, but the fact is that President Xi chaired the committee that created it. So effectively the 18th Congress Political Report was Xi's text. In it he said, or it was written, recall for promoting equality, mutual trust, inclusiveness, mutual learning, and mutually beneficial cooperation in international relations. So that is where the actual root of this, and what it is, it's much broader than Asian civilization, as I said before. What this is a new foreign policy from China, and its root and anchor goes back to the start of President Xi's position in power, and it's extraordinarily consistent. If you read his speeches, that he repeatedly comes back to these themes. So there's a consistency there which is coming together in this conference next week. And it's about China and Asia reaching to the world to have a dialogue of civilizations. That's really important that this message gets across to the world in the current climate. I know you said, let's not bash America. I'm not bashing America. I'm just saying the reality is America is taking a diametrically opposing view to this. I personally feel, and I think most people in Britain feels, is that this dialogue of civilization at the point in time we are in history with all the problems around the world is fundamentally important.
You talk about this timing. Actually, just 2 days ago, we were talking about this subject of a very high position Trump administration official in terms of drafting strategic guidance to the policy of the Trump administration in the future, coming out in the Security Forum and talking about China being the first ever great power competitor to the United States that's not Caucasian. And when the moderator asked whether she was referring to the hypothesis of the clash of civilization by Samuel Huntington, she said pretty much those tenets, just a little bit different. So that draw a lot of criticism from the U.S.'s media and academia. What are we trying to highlight here, Qinduo, drawing on what Alistair has said? When China is saying, come, let's have a dialogue among our Asian civilizations, is China trying to highlight the differences between Asians with non-Asians in other parts of the world? Or is China saying, let's have a dialogue here and see how we can integrate, how we can learn from each other?
It's the latter, obviously. I think I want to stress, I agree with Alistair, there's a consistency. If you look at the speeches made by President Xi Jinping, not only in 2015 Boao Forum, but also 2014, his important speech to UNESCO, he mentioned a lot about this dialogue among different civilizations.
Yeah.
But here, the Asian civilization, I think, of course, this is a neighboring area with China. I think the key here is dialogue among different civilizations. We know, civilizations are unique. People say, they have their own civilization. It's more like a crystallization of their work, crystallization of their wisdom of a group of people. But that's fine. We have differences. But the key is like what we are going to deal with our differences. For the Chinese approach, of course, is more harmony with the diversity. So here is dialogue. It's not about because we're different, so there's the clashes, there's confrontation. We are focusing on not negative side, but also the cooperation.
Yeah. Let me go to our Iranian friend for one final question before saying thank you to him. Mr. Khoshcheshm, are you still there? If you're still there with us, what do you think will be the prospect? What do you think will be the reaction of the West towards? Thank you. Towards this kind of rising Asian value or Asian voice on the international stage. Do you think there will be more danger of a perception of a zero-sum relationship between the Asian and other civilizations, or the East and the West?
Well, it's pretty much clear what kind of reaction this would receive from the United States, especially under President Donald Trump. If he could, he would, force the European Union, even the EU, to fall apart. He does not like, enemies and rivals, even rivals in economic fields. It's no secret that the U.S. has withdrawn from several international agreements, all showing that the U.S. is growing isolation in its foreign policy, in its military, and in economy. So they are totally against very rigorous rival like Asians. Asians, if they are able to sort out their differences and work out some kind of common identity and raise their voice through dialogue among their own civilizations, then they could do the same in the world. Then the U.S. would feel that its imminent interests would be in danger. They are, looking at even talks and dialogue as a way of containment, containing their enemies or rivals' power components in various areas. They never look at dialogue as a way of understanding each other, because they are still believing in Huntington's theory, and whatever they do is in the same line.
All right, we have to leave it there. Many thanks, Mr. Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, joining us from Tehran, Iran. Let me get back to our guests here in the studio. Without going to a break, I think this is too interesting. Time is too precious. Alistair, Mr. Khoshcheshm was talking automatically of the United States as a representative of the West. Is it really a unified vision that the Western country or Western civilizations, according to President Trump's logic, see the dialogue of Asian civilization in a similar light?
No, I think that, I mean, America, you can see, is deeply divided politically. There are many people, I think, roughly, I mean, I'm sure we'd find millions and millions of Americans who do not share Trump's view, who share the view that we should have a dialogue of civilizations. I think there's another aspect why this conference and China's focus on a dialogue of civilizations or Asian influence is really important at the moment. We have this rise of nationalism and populism around the world, which is driving anti-globalization, which is, again, a force that is pushing back against this dialogue of civilizations. So I think this dialogue of civilizations is critically important, that it gains momentum to push back and explain to people there is, you know, mutual benefit through mutual respect and mutual learning about each other's civilizations. We're all different. We all think differently, but we can respect each other and we can live together in harmony if we have this respect and understanding of each other. And that comes through this dialogue of civilization.
Some people would say, just to be the devil's advocate, some people would say, well, in the West, we also respect harmony. We also want to have diversity. We want to pursue harmony between man and nature. We talk about respect. We talk about diversity. So what is so different that we're talking about the Asian values versus what has been the predominantly Western set of values? The difference or the commonality?
Well, I mean, one of my passions is history, and I've been fortunate to be able to study China for about 30 years. But I'm very rare. The most of people in the high-income countries in Europe and USA do not have any sense that we can learn from Asia or learn from China. China has been, is the longest continuous civilization in the world. It's been thinking about how it should govern and how it should create prosperity for about a quarter of the population of the world for over 2,000 years. My answer, or my feeling is, we in Europe and America have a great deal to learn from that, but our mindset is not yet configured that way. Or I think mine is, but many people aren't. But I think in the way that the world is going, where there are so many common problems like climate change, or the issue of nuclear weapons, or the economy, the global economy, these are all things that only can be solved by working together through the whole of humanity. Therefore, that is why a dialogue of civilizations initiated out of Asia is so critically important at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom again, look at it from a historical perspective. Basically, Asian countries, especially China, was very much leading, right? China had one-third of the world's GDP, excuse me, just a couple of hundred years ago, and then in the past 200 years, the West caught up, and China experienced, or Asian countries altogether experienced a very dramatic low point in their status or position in the world. So Qinduo, are we looking at an Asia that's coming out of nowhere, or are we looking at an Asia that's trying to redefine its position, redefine its confidence in this world?
I do think so. I think you see the rise of China. Of course, before the rise of China, you have the rise of Japan, Korea. The four tigers, so-called, like Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. And now India is quickly catching up. You do see, in a sense, you can see China and India, very old civilization. They are restoring their historical position. So they are not, but at the same time, the differences, to answer your question, previous question, is like the differences is, say, at least in the U.S. you see. The U.S. tend to see their, if the civilization or value, see this universal value, democracy, freedom of expression, election, they tend to impose those kind of practices on other countries. But if you look at the Asian values here, no, people believe in diversity. People say diversity itself is no problem because things are born to be different, as Michie once mentioned that. So people respect the diversity. People say because of the diversity, that's why we need the exchanges. We need to learn from each other. Well, learning from each other is actually a driver for the development, for common development, because either side will benefit from that. So that's the idea, like a harmony in diversity.
Actually, I was in Paris in 2014 when President Xi gave a very important speech on the subject of cultural exchanges and mutual learning in the headquarters of the UNESCO, and he highlighted 3 approaches, which is diversity, equality, and inclusiveness. And then he said there is no perfect civilization in the world, nor is there a civilization devoid of any merit. No one civilization can be judged superior to others. So, Alistair, how important, again, looking at what he's saying here, how important is mutual respect for other civilizations, and why is China or Asian countries and civilizations particularly eager to be treated equally and to be given a fair share of say?
That speech that you were privileged to hear at UNESCO was a hugely important speech by Xi Jinping, which it embraced all the thoughts that are going to come together next week in this dialogue, this conference on civilization. In it were the phrases of mutual learning, mutual respect, mutual understanding. We mentioned earlier, I think, but I think it's worth mentioning this again, is the consistency of thinking that's coming out of President Xi since he became General Secretary.
What is China trying to get then with
because
such consistency?
Because it's a rethinking of foreign affairs, that it's moving away from the Cold War mentality, which is, I think, reflected in what Trump is doing today. It's a rethink which is relevant to the world we find today, which is that we are not going to solve the big issues facing us, like climate change or the economy or the nuclear, unless we work together. We're only going to work together if we respect each other, understand each other, and that means, this mutual learning, mutual respect is absolutely crucial.
But there will be a major gathering, a concentration of delegates from Asian countries. Qinduo, very briefly, what kind of role is China envisaging that it will play among Asian countries?
Yeah, I think China stresses very much, just like India, equality among nations, whether they are large and small. At the same time, China also stresses very much, if you're a large nation, that means you have a larger responsibility internationally to bring the countries together here, to have dialogue, to sort out the differences, and to sort out the proper means to deal with the differences, to deal with the common challenges for the future of the Asian nations here. I think that is very important.
Yeah, Alistair, your take, very briefly?
I think, China is rising. China is now the 2nd largest economy in the world. I think it's tremendous to see that China is reaching out, taking responsibility that reflects its size and influence in the world, to rethink foreign policy that is relevant to the world we live in today. And as Xi in his speeches says time and time again, it's about mutual respect, mutual understanding and mutual learning.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my 2 guests, Qinduo, a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution, and Alistair Michie, Secretary General of the British East Asia Council. And with that, we are coming to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.